The impeachment saga has taught America a lot about how Hunter Biden used his father's name to get rich in Ukraine. But there's another way the Biden family enriched itself, by shilling for credit card companies. True. We've got the details. Way more interesting than anything that happened in Ukraine. Our eye-opening report is after the break. Well, thanks to the impeachment proceedings now in progress, we now know a lot more than we ever thought we would about Hunter Biden's business dealings in Ukraine. We know Biden apparently received millions from a foreign company to do work he wasn't even theoretically qualified to do. The purpose of paying him all that money, of course, was to influence his father, who at the time was vice president of the United States and in charge of overseeing reforms in, wait for it, Ukraine. It was a payoff. It was the definition of a corrupt arrangement, obviously. Don't let the liars in Washington, the ones eager to protect their own corruption, tell you it wasn't. It was. But that's not the only scandal that Hunter Biden participated in. In fact, it's not even the worst scandal. Here's a far bigger one that nobody in Washington wants to talk about, in part because it implicates them. Here it is. Immediately after graduating from law school, Biden took a lucrative management track job at MBNA, the Delaware-based credit card company. Now, Hunter Biden worked at MBNA for almost 3 years, and even after he left the company, the checks kept coming. From 2001 to 2005, MBNA sent Hunter Biden more than $100,000 a year for doing, well, it's not exactly clear what he did, if anything. So how do you get a job like that, you may be wondering? One where you get more than twice what the average American family makes a year, but for no work. Well, it's not easy to get a job like that. It helps to have a father in the U.S. Senate, one who's doing the bidding of credit card companies. And Hunter Biden definitely met that requirement. For decades, Joe Biden was one of the country's most enthusiastic servants of the consumer debt industry. Biden was so shameless about it, he was often referred to as the senator from MBNA. Time and again, he carried that company's water on Capitol Hill. For example, in the 1990s, the cost of education and health care skyrocketed for most people, and many middle-class Americans turned to high-interest debt to stay afloat. It was a potentially lucrative period for lenders, but credit card companies worried that too many people might try to escape their debt through bankruptcy. So they turned to the Congress to make that more difficult and, in turn, to protect their business, one of the world's sleaziest and most destructive businesses. Joe Biden was eager to help them. Middle-class Joe was an eager backer of a law designed to hurt the middle class, because everything in Washington is irony. The law was called the Bankruptcy Abuse Prevention and Consumer Protection Act of 2005. Like so many bills that Congress passes, everything about that title was a lie. There was no epidemic of bankruptcy abuse in America at the time. The bill did nothing meaningful to protect consumers. No. Instead, the beneficiaries of the law were credit card companies, and that's why they spent $100 million to get it through the Congress. Before the bill was passed, judges in this country determined whether a bankruptcy filing was abusive and should be dismissed. But thanks to lobbying from high-interest lenders, the standard was changed to a rigid means test of a filer's income. This gave judges less leeway to consider the facts of a particular case. The new law also imposed burdensome new paperwork requirements and put additional liability on bankruptcy attorneys. The result was exactly what the credit card companies had intended. Filing for bankruptcy took longer and cost more, and therefore, and this of course was the real point, fewer people could afford to do it. Some of the bill's provisions were obviously cruel. For example, the new law prevented young people from discharging student loan debt through bankruptcy, even unwise and unfair loans taken from private lenders. Bankruptcy could not erase them. That meant that 18-year-olds who had been pressured into taking on life-destroying amounts of student loan debt could never get rid of that debt. They were stuck with it forever. Think about that for a moment. America's middle class was beginning to crumble in the face of rising education costs. In the end, it did crumble, as you know. So what did Congress do? Congress rushed in to side with the creditors and make that crisis far worse for normal people. Joe Biden was part of the problem. He did far more than most to make it happen. Why would Biden do that? Because he and his family had been thoroughly bribed by big finance, by the credit card companies. And to be fair, they weren't alone in that. We're not going to lie to you. In 2005, every single Republican in Congress voted for the bankruptcy bill. George W. Bush, the president at the time, signed it into law. What did voters think of that? Well, they were not impressed. And why would they be impressed? Republicans were crushed in the next two elections. In 2008, they lost to Barack Obama, who voted against the bankruptcy bill. So what's the lesson of all of this? Well, the lesson should be very clear to both parties, but for some reason never is clear. So write this down. It's the iron law of modern politics. When you take the side of finance over voters, you lose. And by the way, you deserve to lose. Does that make sense? Of course it makes sense. Politicians are literally the only ones who don't understand it.